Okay, so now that you've watched the videos on the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation, this final review video will just help you kind of get your brain around why America went with this form of government we had. So the issue really was in 1787 for the leaders of the United States, men like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, Ben Franklin, and many others. The big choice was whether they should fix the Articles of Confederation or come up with a new plan. Remember, the Articles of Confederation proved to be a very weak form of central government. States really had more of the power. There were no federal taxes to pay for anything. There was no president, no vice president, no Supreme Court. So it really was a very limited federal government. The new challenge would be to, if they were going to come up with a new plan that would be a lot stronger, they would have to convince the states of this new union. So in this class, I'll talk more about this throughout the course, but a union really is a marriage, right? That's really what, when we think of a marriage, it's a union between two people. Well, just kind of get in your brain that this new plan of government would have to be a union between these 13 states and any other states that were brought in, like a marriage, right? You share your money, you share your problems, your successes. All of these things would be a part of what this new government would be like if they decide to go with a new plan to scrap the Articles of Confederation and come up with a new plan. That would mean that the states would be married to each other. So they called this meeting in Philadelphia, a convention, a constitutional convention. Now, they really knew that they were going to be coming up with something new, but they did keep it on the down low. So in May of 1787, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 55 delegates gather. There was no one from Rhode Island. Remember, Rhode Island, and probably being the smallest state, did not want to change their form of government. The Articles of Confederation gave Rhode Island just as much say as big states as Virginia or New York. Each state had one vote under the Articles of Confederation, and so Rhode Island didn't see that anything good could come out of this. It would only mean lessening of their influence in government. So they did not show up at the convention. But this convention of 55 delegates, there were old men and young men. The oldest, Ben Franklin, at 81. The youngest, Jonathan Dayton, he's 26. And then everybody in between. This is the smartest group of men that the colonies could produce. All of them brilliant, either lawyers or even physicians, people who spoke multiple languages, had studied ancient governments and ancient languages. They were really brilliant. They weren't perfect, of course, but they were smart in this area. But we should remember that it's not a very diverse group, right? These are all going to be white men from across the colonies. And that's just the way the world was then. But it was, in fact, very top secret. All the windows would be shut and locked. The door would be locked with guards guarding so that no one could overhear what people are saying and maybe get the word out into the newspapers of what was going on. They wanted it to be free of kind of people listening so that these delegates would be free to change their mind. If they ever changed their mind, they could maybe speak maybe against something at the beginning, and then maybe a month later they could say, yeah, I've changed my mind, you convinced me. And they didn't want people to know about all the discussions that were going on. So remember, this is summer in Philadelphia, and all the doors and windows are shut, and there's no air conditioning. So I bet that was great. The delegates. We tend to think that when we study the Founding Fathers, that all of them were at every meeting writing everything. That's not really true. At this constitutional convention, George Washington was there. He served as the president. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Ben Franklin was there. He's getting up there in age. In fact, he had to be carried around in his chair by some local prisoners. Their duty was to carry him in and set him down and then come at the end of the day and carry him out and for various breaks and things like that. Roger Sherman, we might have talked about him a little bit in the past, but he's the only founding father to actually sign the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and now what will become the U.S. Constitution. But this meeting in Philadelphia, it should remember that not everyone was there. John Adams, Samuel Adams was not there. John Adams was in Europe. Thomas Jefferson was in Europe as well. And Patrick Henry, these are famous people who are founding fathers who would not be there at this convention. In fact, Patrick Henry was really nervous about creating a new federal government. So if you think back to when you studied this last, There are several plans floated about. One for the new government was brought by the people from Virginia. The delegates of Virginia showed up at the meeting with a plan. Edmund Randolph would be the one who would present this plan for the new government. His plan, or the Virginia plan, would call for a two-house legislature. So under the Articles of Confederation, there was only a one house. Now we would have a two-house legislature, and there would be a president, but that president would be chosen by the legislature. The lower house would be chosen by the people, whereas the upper house would be chosen by the lower house. This is very similar to the British system with the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and the House of Commons would select a prime minister. So the Virginia plan was very much like the British plan. However, both the lower and the upper house would be based on population, right? So the more people you have in your state, the more power you would have in the government. You would have more representatives in these two houses if you had more people. So what states would be happy about this? Large states, right? Virginia, New York. These states would have lots of people, therefore they would have more say in the government. Now you can compare that to the Virginia plan, compare that to the New Jersey plan, which was brought to the committee or to the convention by a man named William Patterson. And his plan really was basically just to keep things the way they were under the Articles of Confederation. Keep it with one house with equal representation from each house. However, give Congress the power to tax and to regulate trade, which it did not have under the Articles of Confederation. So you can see what states would like the New Jersey plan. Small states, right, where everybody's equal. New Jersey would have just as much say as New York or Virginia. Rhode Island, these small states would be just as influential as the most populated states. So there's a great deal of debate whether they should accept the Virginia plan or the New Jersey plan. In the end, what they come up with, thanks to Roger Sherman, is basically blending these two plans together. It's known as the Great Compromise. A two-house legislature. The lower one would be based on population and selected by the people. That would give those larger states more say in that lower house, right? They have more people, therefore they would have more representatives in that lower house. The upper house would be two from every state. And the small states like New Jersey or Connecticut would have just as much say in the upper house as those larger states. And this is how Congress is set up today, which we'll be studying this semester. So the compromise brought by Roger Sherman, who was from Connecticut, is sometimes referred to as the Connecticut Compromise, really tended to make both sides happy. Now, how and what type of people will be counted for this lower house, right? So this is going to be really a very difficult situation because slavery was alive and well in those southern states. And had the northern states said, listen, we're not going to have slavery under the new government, all of the southern states would have left. They would have formed their own country, and America as we know it wouldn't exist. So really, they had to figure out a way to make a deal where the northern states would feel somewhat okay with this and the southern states would feel okay with it. Remember, this is a marriage, and if they're going to be married, they have to both agree on, the rules. And there are things that, say, the state of Massachusetts does not like about the state of Maryland, slavery being one of them. And so now they're about ready to be joined in a union. They needed a way to deal with this major issue if this marriage was ever going to work. So what they came up with was something that we know today is just really terrible, but it's what they worked out in that moment. Again, the northern states couldn't have never said no slavery because the southern states would have never, ever agreed to be married to the northern states if they said that. So what they come up with is what's known as the Three-Fifths Compromise. For this lower house, remember, they have to count the people to determine population. So they would count people in New Hampshire, they count those people, and that would determine the number of people and number of representatives in the lower house. But what about slaves in those southern states? Do they count them? If they counted them as a real person, every single slave, that would inflate the numbers of, say, South Carolina. It would make the population of South Carolina greater. Now, of course, the South Carolina said, yes, we should count them. Of course, New Hampshire might say, well, you want to treat them as a person, but you never really treat them as a person any other time. Only now, when we count population, do you want to treat them like a real person. You normally say they're property. So the deal that's worked out is really one that is probably one of the maybe the saddest things that they do at this convention, which would be they decide for every 5 slaves that they count, they will equal 3 people. So in the actual Constitution, as it was originally written, slavery was a part of it and written into it. That's the only way that these southern states would agree to the marriage. So for every 5 states, or for every 5 slaves, they would count as 3 people. They also talked about slave trade, continue to bring in slaves from other countries, from Africa. It would just continue to make the numbers of these southern states go up, the population. So they agreed to have the slave trade put on hold. It will continue, really, but in 20 years they'll look at it, and in 20 years actually they decide to end slave trade, meaning no more slave boats coming to America. By then, slaves are quite numerous. They will have children, and those children will have children, and so the numbers of slaves continues to go up because of the slave families and the children they have and the children that they have. So the Three-Fifths Compromise is really the worst part of this deal. For every 5 slaves, they would count as 3 people. So if they count 10 slaves, it actually equals 6 people. So this convention ends in 1787. It would give us the office of the president. It would give us a Supreme Court. It would give us this Congress that we just talked about with 2 houses. They would have a lower house based on population. Slaves would count. Every 5 slaves, it would equal 3 people. And in the upper house, every state is equal. New Hampshire would have 2 senators. Virginia would have 2 senators. So at the end of 1787, at the end of the convention, the document is ready, and 39 of the 55 men sign it. Now it's off to the states to be voted on. There'd be lots of debate about whether this is too strong of a government. There would be people who would be for it, known as the Federalists, those who would be against it, known as the Anti-Federalist, and they would debate. We'll talk more about that in this course as well. And it would be up to the state governments to vote on this new Constitution. And by 1790, all the states, the 13 states, had agreed to it. So when we think about this Constitution, remember, a lot of people in America today get the Constitution mixed up with the Declaration of Independence, right? They're both founding documents. The Declaration of Independence was written really to say we're free. It's the birth certificate of the United States. It was written primarily by Thomas Jefferson in 1776. Okay, it really does nothing about our government. It doesn't do anything. It has nothing to do, really. It's just about principles. Now, you compare that to the Constitution, which was written in 1787, right? So 11 years later, Thomas Jefferson is not even there. He's in another country. He's over in France. The Constitution gives us the rules for our country, right? It's a rule book. It tells us that we're going to have a president. We're going to have a Congress. This is how we count the people to determine the representatives in the House of Representatives. It says we'll have a Senate where every state is equal, no matter how big or how small. We'll have a Supreme Court. It tells us the powers of the president, the powers of the Congress, the powers of the Supreme Court. All that is in the Constitution, not to be confused with the Declaration of Independence. All right? So this class really will be a study of what the Constitution says about American government. Right? So in this little graphic, it'll help you maybe understand that, when we see we the people, we're saying that's our rule book, the Constitution that was written at this convention in 1787 that tells that the states are now married to each other. So New York is now married to Georgia with all of the baggage that both states bring to the marriage. They just have to deal with it. All the states are now united together, and we'll have, under this Constitution, a legislative branch, the Congress, an executive branch, the president and vice president, and a judicial branch, the Supreme Court, and all the federal courts. And this all comes out of this meeting in the summer of 1787. So remember, the Constitution is the rule book where we get all the things we're going to talk about in this class this semester.